Hello there, and welcome. Tonight, we are stepping into a world that tested every limit of human endurance. No grocery stores, no medicine cabinets, no safety nets of any kind. Only the raw edge of existence where the Stone Age stretched across thousands of years, and every sunrise was a gift that had to be fought for. I'd like you to imagine it for a moment. A group of early humans crouched in the half-light before dawn. The air is sharp and cold. Their stomachs are empty and have been for days. Somewhere beyond the rocks where they shelter, animals are moving, and those animals represent the only chance this group has to eat. They do not know if today will bring food or failure, but they know one thing. They must try, as they always have, with nothing but crude weapons and the desperate hope that their efforts will be enough. This is not a story told from the comfort of distance. This is the human experience at its most raw, before agriculture transformed the world, before metal replaced stone, before the first permanent homes rose from the earth. There was a kind of struggle that shaped everything we would become. So if you are ready, let the certainty of the present fade for a little while. Set aside the abundance we take for granted and the security we assume. We are going to walk carefully, quietly, into an age where hunger was not occasional but constant. A time when survival was not a concept discussed in books. It was the only reality that mattered. In the Stone Age, food was never guaranteed. There were no fields of grain, no herds penned safely behind fences, no storage rooms stocked for winter. Every calorie had to be earned from a world that gave nothing freely. And the pursuit of food, whether through the hunt or the patient search for plants, defined nearly every waking hour. Survival was not abstract. It was the gnawing ache in the belly, the weakness in the limbs, and the constant question of where the next meal would come from. Imagine waking in the Stone Age. The sun has barely risen and already your body is demanding food. But there is none waiting, no bread on a table, no fruit in a bowl, only the wilderness stretching in every direction and the knowledge that if you want to eat, you will have to find it yourself. This is how every day began, with hunger and the need to answer it. Hunting was one path to survival, but it was never easy. Early humans were not the fastest creatures, not the strongest, not the most naturally armed. They had no claws, no fangs, no thick hide to protect them. What they had were minds that could plan and hands that could shape tools. With sharpened stones lashed to wooden shafts, they created spears. With patience and observation, they learned the habits of prey. And with cooperation, they turned individual weakness into collective strength. The hunt began long before any weapon was raised. It started with tracking. Hunters studied the ground for prints pressed into mud or dust. They followed broken twigs and scattered droppings. They read the landscape like a language, noticing where animals had passed and where they might be headed. A bent blade of grass or a disturbed patch of dirt told them stories that others could not see. This knowledge was not written anywhere. It lived in memory, passed from the experienced to the young through demonstration and quiet correction. When prey was located, the approach had to be perfect. Humans learned to move with the wind so their scent would not betray them. They crept low through tall grass, each step placed with agonizing care. One snapped branch, one startled bird taking flight, and the hunt could collapse before it ever began. Patience was as important as any weapon. Sometimes they waited for hours, watching, learning the rhythm of the animal's movements before making their move. The kill itself was brief and violent. Spears flew through the air. Stone points struck flesh. If the throw was true, the animal fell. If not, it bolted, and the hunters returned empty-handed to face another hungry night. Every failed hunt carried weight. It meant bellies would stay empty. It meant children would cry. It meant the group would grow weaker while they tried again. But when a hunt succeeded, when an animal finally fell and did not rise, relief swept through the group like a wave. This was not sport. This was survival made real. The animal was butchered where it lay. Hands moved quickly with sharp stone blades to strip meat from bone. Nothing was wasted. The hide would become clothing or shelter. The bones would become tools. The sinew would bind and stitch. Even the marrow inside the bones was precious, cracked open with stones and scraped out for its rich fat. Every part of the animal served a purpose because waste was a luxury no one could afford. Meat provided dense nutrition that could sustain the group for days, but it came with challenges. Without refrigeration, it spoiled quickly, so humans learned to dry it in the sun or smoke it over fires, preserving what they could for leaner times. They learned to share the kill among the entire group because today's successful hunter might be tomorrow's injured or sick, dependent on others for survival. This sharing was not generosity, it was insurance. Yet hunting alone could not sustain them. There were too many days when prey escaped or could not be found. There were seasons when animals migrated beyond reach. For every successful hunt, there were failures, and in those gaps, starvation lurked. This is where gathering became just as vital as the chase. While hunters tracked game, others moved through the landscape searching for anything edible. They dug for roots buried beneath the soil, their fingers scraping through dirt to find tubers that could fill an empty stomach. They plucked berries from bushes, learning through painful experience which ones were safe and which brought sickness or death. They cracked nuts with stones, stripped bark from certain trees, and pulled grubs from rotting logs. Nothing that could be eaten was ignored. The knowledge required for gathering was immense. A plant safe in one season might be toxic in another. A root that looked identical to a harmless one could kill within hours. This information could not be guessed. It had to be remembered and taught. Elders became living libraries, carrying in their minds the accumulated wisdom of generations. They showed the young which leaves to crush for medicine, which fungi to avoid, which seeds could be ground into paste. Every piece of knowledge was a thread in the fragile web that kept starvation at bay. Gathering was slower than hunting, quieter, less dramatic, but it was reliable. While hunts could fail for days, plants could almost always be found. Berries, nuts, roots, and greens provided consistent calories that kept the group alive between kills. In many ways, gathered foods were the foundation of survival, and meat was the rare abundance that punctuated long stretches of plant-based subsistence. The division of labor made sense. Those with the strength and speed for hunting pursued game. Others, often women and older members of the group, focused on gathering. Children learned both skills, watching their elders and slowly taking on more responsibility. A child might start by carrying gathered plants, then learn to identify them, then eventually join the search. By the time they reached adulthood, they carried the knowledge needed to feed themselves and others. But the search for food was never without danger. Gatherers faced threats just as hunters did. A poisonous snake hidden in the undergrowth, a sudden encounter with a predator, a fall from a tree while reaching for fruit. Even the act of digging for roots could slice open a hand on a sharp stone, and in a world without antibiotics, infections could turn deadly. Every task carried risk, and every risk had to be weighed against the need to eat. Seasons dictated everything. Spring brought new growth, tender shoots pushing through soil, and animals emerging from winter hiding. Summer offered abundance, long days to search and gather, and prey fattened on rich grazing. Autumn was a race against time, a scramble to collect and store as much as possible before the world turned cold. Winter was survival at its harshest, when food became scarce and every day was a test of endurance. In winter, humans relied on what they had preserved and what little they could scavenge. They chewed on dried meat and gnawed on stored roots. They broke through ice to fish in frozen streams and tracked animals through snow, following prints until exhaustion or success claimed them. The cold made every action harder, every search more desperate. Those who entered winter unprepared often did not see spring. This relentless cycle shaped human existence. Food was not just sustenance, it was the center around which everything else revolved. Where food could be found determined where groups traveled. When food was plentiful, determined when they rested. How much food they secured determined whether they would survive to see another season. And through this endless struggle, humans learned lessons that would define them. They learned cooperation, that sharing a kill meant everyone survived. They learned patience, that waiting for the right moment meant the difference between success and failure. They learned observation, that the natural world spoke a language and those who listened could hear it. They learned to be flexible, to hunt when prey was near and gather when it was not. Every meal was a victory, every full belly was temporary security, and every sunrise brought the same question that had greeted humans since the beginning. Where will we find food today? But finding food was only part of the battle, because even with full stomachs, even with the strength to face another day, there was still the night, and in the darkness, hunger was not the only thing that hunted. When the sun disappeared, the Stone Age world transformed. Darkness was total in a way we can barely comprehend today. No streetlights, no glowing windows, no distant cities painting the horizon. When night fell, it fell completely, and in that blackness, humans were no longer the hunters. They became the hunted. The night belonged to predators, lions, leopards, hyenas, wolves, saber-toothed cats. These creatures ruled the darkness with eyes adapted to see what humans could not and senses sharp enough to detect the faintest movement or smell. For early humans, the hours between dusk and dawn were the most dangerous of their lives. To survive the night required more than courage. It required strategy. Fire was the first and most important defense. The flames pushed back the darkness and created a circle of safety that most predators would not cross. The light allowed humans to see the glowing eyes that gathered just beyond its reach. The heat kept them warm through cold hours that could kill as surely as any predator, and the smoke carried their scent upward, masking them from creatures that hunted by smell. But fire was not perfect protection. It could die if not tended. Wind could scatter embers, rain could drown flames, and maintaining fire through the night required constant vigilance. Someone always had to stay awake, feeding the flames, watching the darkness, listening for sounds that meant danger was approaching. This was the beginning of the watch. A practice that would define human survival for thousands of years. The watchers sat by the fire while others slept. They stared into the night, their eyes adjusting to the faint glow of stars and moon. They listened to every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of grass, the distant call of a hunting pack. Each noise had meaning. Some were harmless, the movement of wind or small animals. Others were warnings that something large and dangerous was out there, circling, testing the edges of the firelight, looking for weakness. Fear was constant, but it was not paralyzing. It was sharpening. It kept the watchers alert. It made their ears sensitive to the slightest change in the night's rhythm. When danger came too close, when eyes reflected in the firelight or a low growl rumbled from the darkness, the watchers woke the others. Spears were grabbed, voices were raised in shouts meant to scare away whatever prowled beyond the light. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. Shelters offered additional protection. Caves were ideal when they could be found, their stone walls providing defense and their narrow entrances easier to guard than open ground, but caves were rare and often already occupied by the very predators humans feared. When caves were not available, humans built what they could. Crude walls of branches, barriers of thorns, anything to create a boundary between themselves and the wild. These shelters were never perfect. They could not stop a determined predator, but they slowed attacks and gave humans precious seconds to react. And in those seconds, the difference between life and death was decided. Predators taught humans lessons that shaped their behavior. They learned to sleep in groups, pressed close together so that many sets of eyes and ears could watch for danger. They learned to choose campsites carefully, avoiding areas where predators hunted most often. They learned the patterns of different hunters, that lions preferred certain terrain, that leopards dragged kills into trees, that hyenas hunted in packs and could overwhelm even a defended camp if they were desperate enough. This knowledge was survival. Every night that passed without an attack was a victory. Every morning that dawned with the group intact was proof that vigilance worked. But the cost was exhaustion. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and broken. True rest was rare. The human body adapted, learning to function on less, to wake at the slightest disturbance, to exist in a state of constant readiness. Children grew up in this world and learned its rules before they could speak. They learned to stay quiet when the adults tensed. They learned to recognize the sounds that meant danger. They learned that the fire was not just warmth, but safety, and that letting it die could cost lives. These lessons were not taught through words at first, but through the terror of close calls and the relief of survival. The night also shaped human social bonds. Trust became essential. The person who stayed awake to watch over the group while others slept held everyone's lives in their hands. That responsibility was sacred. Betrayal or carelessness could doom them all. And so, around the fire, in the quiet hours of the watch, humans learned to depend on one another in ways that went deeper than cooperation. They learned loyalty. Even with all their precautions, attacks happened. A predator driven by hunger might risk the fire. A pack might test the defenses and find them lacking. In those moments, chaos erupted. Spears were thrust into the darkness. Shouts filled the air. Fire was brandished like a weapon. Burning branches swung at glowing eyes. Sometimes the predator retreated. Sometimes it did not. The injured and the dead were grim reminders that survival was never certain. Yet humans endured. They adapted. They learned. And slowly, generation by generation, they became better at defending themselves. They developed better weapons, sharper points, longer reach. They learned to build stronger barriers and choose safer locations. They became students of the creatures that hunted them, understanding their behaviors well enough to anticipate attacks. The night remained dangerous, but it became survivable. And in surviving it, humans gained something unexpected: confidence. They learned that they were not helpless, that intelligence and cooperation could match teeth and claws, that even in darkness, even when afraid, they could hold their ground. This confidence would carry them forward into new challenges, new landscapes, and new ways of living. But for now, in the Stone Age night, they simply watched. They fed the fire. They listened to the darkness. And when dawn finally broke, when the first light touched the horizon and the predators retreated into shadow, they felt relief wash over them. Another night survived, another day earned. The cycle would begin again, because in the Stone Age, survival was never a destination. It was an endless journey, one night and one day at a time, fought for with every tool, every flame, and every ounce of will they possessed. And speaking of tools, it was these simple instruments that gave humans their greatest advantage. Because while they could not outrun predators or overpower prey with bare hands, they could shape the world around them into weapons and defenses that leveled the playing field. The first tools were accidents. A rock split in two revealed a sharp edge. A heavy stone could crack open bones. These discoveries were not planned. They were noticed. And once noticed, they were remembered. Over generations, accidents became intentions. Humans learned which rocks fractured cleanly and which crumbled uselessly. They learned that striking one stone against another at the right angle could produce a blade sharp enough to slice through hide and meat. They learned that patience in shaping a tool meant the difference between something that worked once and something that could be used again and again. Flint became precious. Obsidian, when it could be found, was even better. These stones held edges sharper than anything nature had given them. A well-made flint blade could cut cleaner than teeth. A stone point lashed to a wooden shaft created a spear that extended their reach and turned a desperate jab into a killing strike from a safer distance. The making of these tools required skill that took years to develop. A novice might strike 100 times and produce nothing but useless fragments. An experienced toolmaker could read the stone, seeing the hidden potential inside it, and with careful, deliberate strikes, reveal the blade that had been waiting to emerge. This was not just labor. It was craft. Children watched the toolmakers work. They saw the concentration, the way each strike was measured, the sound that meant success versus the dull thud of failure. They picked up broken pieces and tried to imitate what they had seen. Most of their early attempts were clumsy, but through repetition their hands learned. The muscle memory developed, and eventually they too could shape stone into tools that meant survival. These tools transformed hunting. A wooden spear hardened in fire was dangerous, but a stone-tipped spear was lethal. The stone point could pierce deep, reaching vital organs, bringing down prey that would have escaped a less effective weapon. Hunters could strike from farther away, reducing the risk of being gored or trampled. The invention of the atlatl, a spear thrower that used leverage to multiply throwing force, made them even more deadly. Suddenly, humans could hunt animals that had once been beyond their capability. Tools also changed how they processed kills. Sharp stone blades made butchering faster and more efficient. They could strip meat from bone in minutes rather than hours. They could scrape hides clean, preparing them for use as clothing or shelter. They could cut sinew into cords for binding. Every improvement in tool technology meant less time exposed to danger and more resources extracted from each kill. But tools were not just for hunting, they were for building. Stone axes could fell small trees and shape wood into poles for shelters. Stone scrapers could smooth branches and remove bark. Pointed tools could dig into hard earth, creating fire pits or storage holes. With each new application, tools expanded what was possible. Humans were no longer limited by what their bodies could do. They were limited only by what they could imagine and create. The durability of stone meant tools could last. A well-made blade might serve a hunter for months or even years. When it dulled, it could be resharpened. When it broke, the pieces could sometimes be reworked into smaller tools. Nothing was discarded if it still had use. This economy of resources reflected the harsh reality of Stone Age life, where everything had value and waste was unthinkable. Tools also became markers of skill and status. A person who could make superior tools was valuable to the group. Their work armed the hunters, equipped the gatherers, and built the shelters that protected everyone. In return, they were fed and cared for even when they were not hunting or gathering themselves. This was one of the earliest forms of specialization, a recognition that different people had different talents and that the group benefited when each person focused on what they did best. Some tools were clearly functional, designed purely for efficiency. Others showed signs of something more, symmetry beyond what was necessary, smoothness that served no practical purpose. These hints of aesthetic consideration suggest that even in the desperate struggle for survival, humans found moments to create beauty. A perfectly balanced hand axe was not just a tool, it was a statement, evidence of skill, patience, and pride. The spread of tool technology accelerated human expansion. With better weapons and implements, groups could survive in harsher environments. They could hunt larger game, build sturdier shelters, and process tougher materials. Each innovation opened new territories that had previously been too dangerous or resource-poor to inhabit. Tools were the key that unlocked these new worlds. But tools also required maintenance and replacement. Stone blades chipped and broke, wooden shafts cracked, bindings of sinew loosened and rotted. Part of survival was the constant work of repair and creation. There was always another blade to knap, another spear to balance, another edge to sharpen. This work filled the hours around the fire, the quiet times when hunting was not possible or when weather kept the group sheltered. It was meditative, repetitive, but essential. And as tools evolved, so did the humans who made them. The cognitive demands of tool-making, the ability to envision a finished product and work backward through the steps needed to create it, helped shape the developing human brain. Tool-making required planning, problem-solving, and fine motor control. It rewarded patience and punished impulsivity. These mental exercises, repeated across thousands of generations, may have contributed to the growth of human intelligence itself. In this way, tools were not just instruments of survival, they were teachers, they trained hands and minds, they created feedback loops, where better tools allowed access to better resources, which supported larger, healthier populations, which produced more skilled toolmakers, who created even better tools. This cycle of improvement, slow but relentless, pushed human capabilities ever forward. The tools themselves tell a story. Archaeologists can trace the evolution of stone tool technology across hundreds of thousands of years. Early tools were simple choppers and flakes. Later came carefully shaped hand axes, then blade technology, where a single core stone could be struck to produce multiple sharp flakes, then composite tools with stone points hafted onto wooden handles. Each stage represented not just technical advancement but cognitive development, the ability to plan, to teach, to refine techniques across generations. These were not just rocks chipped into useful shapes. They were evidence of minds at work, minds that could look at a problem and devise solutions, minds that could remember what worked and discard what did not, minds that were becoming, step by careful step, recognizably human. And those minds, armed with the tools they had created, were ready to face challenges that would test every limit of their resourcefulness. Because survival in the Stone Age was not just about finding food and avoiding predators, it was about enduring a climate that could turn hostile with terrifying speed and adapting to changes that transformed the entire world they knew. The world was never stable for long. The climate shifted, sometimes gradually over centuries, sometimes with shocking speed. Ice ages advanced and retreated, turning temperate forests into frozen tundras and back again. Sea levels rose and fell, creating land bridges and then drowning them beneath the waves. Rainfall patterns changed, transforming grasslands into deserts or swamps. For Stone Age humans, these changes were not abstract concepts. They were matters of life and death. When the climate cooled, the changes cascaded through everything. Plants that had been reliable food sources died off or migrated to warmer regions. The animals that fed on those plants followed. Humans who depended on those animals had to choose, move or starve. Most chose to move. The great migrations of human prehistory were not adventures or explorations. They were desperate pursuits of survival. Families and groups loaded themselves with everything they could carry and walked toward uncertainty. They followed herds south, tracked rivers to new sources, climbed over mountains that had never known human footsteps. Children and elders struggled with the pace. The weak fell behind. Not every journey succeeded, but those who stayed in places where food had vanished did not survive to tell their stories. The migrants, the ones who pushed forward despite exhaustion and fear, became the ancestors of future generations. The cold brought other challenges beyond the scarcity of food. Human bodies adapted for warmer climates were poorly equipped for freezing temperatures. Bare skin and sparse body hair offered little protection against bitter winds and sub-zero nights. Without adaptation, hypothermia was a constant threat. This is where clothing became essential, not for modesty or decoration, but for pure survival. The first clothing was crude, animal hides draped over shoulders and tied with strips of sinew. But over time, it evolved. Humans learned to scrape hides clean, removing flesh and fat that would rot. They learned to work the leather, making it softer and more pliable. They discovered that certain methods of tanning could make hides more durable and resistant to water. And most importantly, they learned to sew. The invention of the bone needle was as revolutionary as any weapon. With needles made from slivers of bone or antler and thread made from sinew or plant fibers, humans could stitch hides together into fitted garments. Instead of loose wrappings that let cold air inside, they created tunics and leggings that hugged the body and trapped warmth. They made hoods to protect heads and ears. They wrapped feet in leather bound with cord, the ancestors of shoes. Each improvement in clothing extended the range of environments humans could endure. With proper clothing, the frozen north became survivable. Groups pushed into territories that had been unthinkable for their ancestors. They followed mammoths and reindeer across ice-covered plains, hunting the massive beasts and using their thick furs for even better cold weather gear. Mammoth hide, in particular, was prized. Thick and insulating, a single hide could be fashioned into a garment that could keep a person alive through the harshest winter. Shelter design also adapted to the cold. In treeless tundra, there was no wood for building, so humans turned to what was available. They constructed homes from the bones of mammoths, creating frameworks from enormous ribs and skulls, then covering these frames with hides and packing the edges with soil and snow for insulation. Inside these bone houses, with a fire burning at the center, humans created pockets of warmth in a landscape of ice. Some groups discovered that digging partially underground provided natural insulation. A pit dwelling, with its floor below ground level and walls banked with earth, stayed warmer than any above-ground structure. The earth itself became an ally, its thermal mass moderating the temperature swings from day to night. These semi-subterranean homes would become common in cold climates, a design that worked so well it persisted for thousands of years. Fire became even more critical in cold climates. It was not just comfort, it was survival. Letting the fire die in the depths of winter could mean death within hours, so the responsibility of firekeeping grew heavier. Fuel had to be gathered constantly. In forested areas, this meant endless collection of dead wood. In treeless zones, it meant burning bones, dried dung, or any combustible material that could be found. The search for fuel could consume as much time and energy as the search for food. Groups learned to build fires more efficiently. They created fire pits lined with stones that absorbed and radiated heat long after the flames died down. They used smoke holes in their shelters to vent toxic fumes while retaining warmth. They learned to bank fires at night, covering coals with ash so they would smolder until morning when they could be rekindled. These techniques, developed through trial and error, turned fire from a simple tool into a sophisticated technology. But climate change was not just about cold. In some regions and eras, the world grew warmer. Glaciers retreated, forests expanded, and new environments emerged. These changes brought different challenges. Warming climates could actually make survival harder in some ways. Forests were dense and difficult to navigate. The large game of the open tundra was replaced by smaller, faster animals that were harder to hunt. New diseases emerged in warmer, wetter conditions. Insects became problems in ways they had not been in the cold. Humans adapted to these changes too. They developed new hunting techniques suited to forest environments. They learned to fish more effectively as rivers and lakes expanded. They discovered new plants that thrived in the changing climate and added them to their diets. The ability to adapt, to learn new skills and abandon old ones that no longer worked, became the defining characteristic of human survival. The rising and falling of sea levels created and destroyed opportunities. During ice ages, so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped dramatically. Land bridges emerged, connecting continents that are now separated by ocean. Humans crossed these bridges, often without realizing they were moving from one landmass to another. They simply followed the herds and the food, and in doing so, they spread across the globe. When the ice melted and seas rose again, some populations were cut off. The land bridges flooded and disappeared. Groups that had crossed became isolated on islands or new continents. Without contact with their ancestral populations, these isolated groups developed their own cultures, their own tool technologies, and eventually their own physical characteristics. The geographic separation caused by changing sea levels contributed to the diversity of human populations we see today. Weather patterns also shifted. Areas that had been reliably wet became arid. Rivers changed course or dried up entirely. Lakes that had sustained generations evaporated into salt flats. When water sources vanished, humans had to find new ones or die. The search for water drove migrations just as powerfully as the search for food. Groups learned to recognize signs of water from a distance. The green line of vegetation that marked a hidden stream. The flight patterns of birds that indicated a water source nearby, the taste of the air that suggested rain was coming. These skills, developed over countless dry seasons and desperate searches, became survival knowledge passed down through generations. In arid environments, humans learned to survive on less water than seems possible. They knew which plants stored moisture in their roots or stems. They understood how to collect dew in the early morning. They learned that certain animals, when killed, provided liquid as well as meat. Every drop counted and nothing was wasted. Some groups developed remarkable adaptations to their environments. Those in coastal areas became skilled at harvesting the ocean, developing tools for fishing and techniques for gathering shellfish. They learned to read tides and seasons, to know when certain fish would be plentiful and where to find them. The ocean provided a stability that the land sometimes could not, and coastal populations often grew larger and more settled than their inland counterparts. Others adapted to mountains, learning to navigate steep terrain and thin air. They became skilled climbers, able to traverse slopes that would kill the careless. They hunted mountain goats and other animals adapted to high altitudes. They learned which high-altitude plants were edible and which passes remained open even in winter. The challenges were immense, but the mountains also provided refuge from enemies and from overhunting in the lowlands. Desert dwellers developed their own specializations. They learned to travel at night when temperatures were bearable and to seek shelter during the brutal midday heat. They knew every water source in their territory and the routes between them. They became masters of tracking, able to follow faint traces across sand and rock. Their survival depended on knowledge and memory in ways that other environments did not demand to quite the same degree. Through all these environmental changes, one truth remained constant. Humans survived because they could adapt. They were not as strong as the predators they faced. They were not as fast as the prey they hunted. They did not have fur for warmth or specialized digestive systems for harsh foods. What they had was flexibility. The ability to observe, to learn, to change their behavior and their technology to match whatever the world threw at them. And this adaptability, this refusal to be limited by the bodies they were born with, allowed them to spread into every corner of the planet, from tropical jungles to Arctic wastes, from coastal shores to high mountains, from open grasslands to dense forests. Humans found a way to survive. Each environment demanded different solutions, but the underlying approach was always the same: watch, learn, adapt, and survive. The climate would continue to change, challenges would continue to arise, but humans had discovered something that no other species possessed to the same degree: the ability to reshape themselves and their world to meet those challenges. Not through evolution, which took thousands of generations, but through culture, which could change in a single lifetime. This was the key to their success, and it was just beginning. Yet even as they spread across the world and adapted to countless environments, humans carried with them something that transcended survival. Around their fires, in their shelters, during the quiet moments between hunts, they began to create meaning. They began to ask not just how to survive, but why they were here at all. And in those questions, the seeds of something entirely new began to grow. The fire crackled in the night, the darkness pressed close, and humans, safe for a moment in their circle of light, looked up at the stars and wondered. This was the beginning of something that would define them as much as any tool or technique. The search for meaning in a world that seemed vast and indifferent. The hunt was successful, the fire was warm, but as humans sat together full and safe for one more night, they did not simply sleep. They thought. They looked at the world around them and saw more than resources and threats. They saw mystery. The sun rose every morning, but why? The moon changed its shape through the month, but for what purpose? Animals could be hunted and killed, but did they feel? Did they have spirits? And when a person died, when the breath left them and the warmth faded, where did they go? These questions had no practical answers. They could not be solved with better tools or hunting strategies, but they demanded attention anyway, because humans had developed something that may have been unique in the natural world. The ability to wonder about things beyond immediate survival. In the firelight, the elders spoke. They told stories that tried to make sense of what they saw. Maybe the sun was a great being who traveled across the sky. Maybe the stars were the fires of ancestors watching over them. Maybe the thunder was the voice of something powerful and unseen. These were not lies or delusions. They were the first attempts to create a framework for understanding existence. The stories varied from group to group. Each tribe developed its own explanations based on what they experienced and what their ancestors had taught them, but certain themes appeared again and again. The belief that natural forces had intention, that animals had spirits that should be honored, that the dead continued in some form beyond the grave, that actions had consequences not just in the physical world but in a spiritual one. These beliefs shaped behavior. Before a hunt, a ritual might be performed, a prayer spoken, an offering made, not because anyone could prove it helped, but because it felt right. It acknowledged that the hunt was not just a mechanical process, but something that connected the hunters to forces larger than themselves. The ritual gave meaning to the violence of the kill and created a sense of respect for the animal that died. Death itself became ritualized. Instead of simply abandoning bodies or throwing them aside, humans began to bury their dead with care. Graves were dug, bodies were positioned deliberately, sometimes curled as if sleeping, sometimes laid with tools or food nearby. This practice suggests a belief in an afterlife, a place where the dead would need the things they had needed in life. Or perhaps it was simply a way of honoring those who were gone, of saying that their lives had mattered. Burial sites became sacred places. Groups would return to them, remembering those who had died there. Children would be told stories of ancestors they had never met. These stories created continuity, a sense that each generation was part of something larger than itself. The individual was temporary, but the tribe was eternal. Around the fire, the stories grew more elaborate. They became narratives with structure, with characters and lessons. A story about a great hunt might also carry a warning about pride. A tale about a dangerous animal might teach respect for nature's power. These stories entertained, but they also educated. They passed down wisdom in a form that could be remembered and retold. Music likely emerged during this era, though we can only speculate about its form. Rhythm could be created with stones, with sticks, with hands clapping. Voices could chant in unison. These sounds may have accompanied rituals or simply provided a way to bond the group together. Music requires coordination and cooperation. It creates a shared experience that transcends words. And it may have been one of the earliest forms of art that humans created together. Evidence of artistic expression appears in the archaeological record. Cave paintings, some breathtakingly beautiful, show animals rendered with skill and attention to detail. Handprints stenciled on walls created by blowing pigment around a hand pressed to the stone are found in caves around the world. Carved figurines, some depicting animals, others showing exaggerated female forms perhaps related to fertility, hint at symbolic thinking and ritual significance. These artworks were not idle doodling. They were created with intention, often in deep, dark parts of caves far from living areas. Reaching these places required effort, crawling through narrow passages, navigating total darkness with only crude torches for light. The fact that humans went to such lengths to create these images suggests they held deep significance. Perhaps they were part of rituals meant to ensure successful hunts. Perhaps they were teaching tools. Perhaps they were simply expressions of awe at the world around them. Whatever their purpose, they represent a transformation. Humans were no longer just surviving. They were trying to understand. They were creating symbols, representations of reality that existed separately from the things they depicted. This was abstract thought made visible. The ability to think symbolically changed everything. A line drawn in the dirt could represent a boundary. A stack of stones could mark a grave or a meeting place. A painted animal could stand for the entire species. These symbols allowed humans to communicate complex ideas without words. They created shared understanding across the group and even across time, as images painted on cave walls spoke to people who would see them generations later. Religious or spiritual beliefs, primitive as they were, served practical purposes. They provided comfort in the face of death and uncertainty. They created social cohesion through shared rituals and stories. They offered explanations for phenomena that otherwise seemed random and terrifying. When lightning struck or disease swept through the group, the belief that these events had spiritual causes made them feel less chaotic. If the spirits were angry, perhaps they could be appeased. If they were testing the tribe, perhaps the tribe could prove worthy. These beliefs gave humans a sense of agency in a world where they often had very little. Shamans or spiritual leaders likely emerged during this period. Certain individuals, perhaps those who experienced vivid dreams or visions, might have been seen as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. They conducted rituals, interpreted signs, and guided the group's spiritual practices. Their role was not just religious, but social. They helped bind the community together through shared ceremony and belief. The boundaries between practical knowledge and spiritual belief were blurred. A healer who knew which plants could cure illness might also believe those plants were gifts from spirits. A hunter who understood animal behavior might also perform rituals to thank the animal's spirit after a kill. Knowledge and belief reinforced each other, creating a worldview that was both pragmatic and mystical. As humans spread across different environments, their spiritual beliefs adapted just as their tools and techniques did. A coastal tribe might develop beliefs centered on the ocean and its creatures. A mountain people might see their peaks as sacred dwelling places of powerful spirits. A desert group might worship the sun and the rare gift of rain. Each environment shaped not just how people survived, but how they understood their place in the world. These early belief systems were the ancestors of all religion, all philosophy, all attempts to find meaning beyond mere existence. They represent the moment when survival was no longer enough, when humans began to ask not just how to live, but why, when they looked at the stars and wondered if something was looking back. And in this search for meaning, in these stories told by firelight and images painted on cave walls, humans took another step toward becoming fully human. They were no longer just clever animals using tools. They were beings who created culture, who sought understanding, who built systems of meaning that transcended any individual life. But even as they developed these rich inner worlds, the practical demands of survival never stopped. The hunt continued, the seasons changed, and the eternal question of where to find the next meal remained. Yet now, as they pursued that meal, they did so with something new, a sense that they were part of a larger story, connected to ancestors who had come before and descendants who would come after. This awareness of continuity, this sense of being part of something bigger than the immediate moment, gave them strength. It made the struggle meaningful. It transformed mere survival into a kind of purpose. And so, with tools in their hands, fire at their backs, stories in their hearts, and questions in their minds, Stone Age humans pressed forward. They adapted to new climates, developed new technologies, and spread across the entire planet. They survived ice ages and droughts, predators and disease, hunger and cold. They survived because they were flexible, because they cooperated, because they learned, and because they never stopped trying. The Stone Age was not a single moment, but an immense span of time. Hundreds of thousands of years during which the foundations of humanity were laid. Every skill we possess, every instinct we carry, every capacity for adaptation and innovation traces back to those distant ancestors who faced a world far harsher than ours and refused to surrender to it. They learned to hunt when hunting seemed impossible. They learned to gather when the land seemed barren. They learned to make fire when darkness threatened to consume them. They learned to craft tools when their bodies were inadequate to the task. They learned to build shelters when the elements were merciless. They learned to defend themselves when predators ruled the night. They learned to adapt when the climate transformed their entire world. And they learned to find meaning when existence seemed cruel and random. Each of these lessons was purchased with suffering, with failure, with death. But each was also a triumph. Each represented human will refusing to break. Each was a step forward on the long journey from vulnerable prey to the dominant species on Earth. We are their descendants. We carry their genes, their instincts, and the legacy of their struggles. When we feel fear in the dark, that is them speaking through us. When we gather around a fire or a table to share food and stories, that is them living on in our actions. When we solve problems with tools and technology, that is their innovation echoing across millennia. When we work together to overcome challenges too great for any individual, that is their cooperation manifesting in modern form. The Stone Age never truly ended. It lives in us, in the structure of our brains and the patterns of our behavior. We are Stone Age creatures living in a modern world, shaped by the same forces that shaped them, driven by the same needs, carrying the same capacity for adaptation that allowed them to survive when survival should have been impossible. And if you listen closely past all the noise and comfort and certainty of modern life, you can hear them. The rhythm of stones being struck together, the crackle of the first fire pushing back the dark, the quiet footfalls of hunters tracking prey across ancient grasslands, the voices of people gathered close, speaking in languages long forgotten, telling stories that have been lost to time. They are there in the deepest parts of who we are, and everything we have built, everything we have become, stands on the foundation they created. They survived, they adapted, they persevered, and because they did, we are here. The Stone Age was not just the beginning of human history, it was the forging of human nature itself, and though the world has changed beyond anything they could have imagined, the core of what they were, the essence of what allowed them to endure, remains unchanged within us. We are them. We are their continuation. We are the answer to the question of whether they would survive. And as long as we remember where we came from, as long as we honour the struggle that brought us here, as long as we carry forward the lessons they learned in blood and cold and hunger, they will never truly be gone. They live on in every fire we light, every tool we make, every challenge we face together, and every moment we pause to wonder at the vastness of existence. The Stone Age shaped us, and we, in turn, carry it forward into whatever future awaits. This is how humans survived the Stone Age. Not through any single innovation or discovery, but through the accumulation of countless small adaptations, through the bonds of community, through the flexibility to change when change was demanded, and through the stubborn, unbreakable will to see another sunrise. They survived because they refused to quit. And that refusal, that core of human persistence, is their greatest gift to us. It runs in our blood. It shapes our minds. and it will carry us forward just as it carried them through whatever challenges tomorrow brings. The persistence that carried Stone Age humans through millennia of hardship was not romantic or noble in the moment. It was grim, exhausted, and often desperate, but it was also unbreakable. When a hunt failed for the third day in a row and children cried from hunger, they did not give up. They tried again. When winter stretched longer than expected and food stores ran low, they rationed and endured. When disease swept through the group and took the young and old, the survivors grieved and then continued, because continuing was the only choice that led to survival. Stories became more elaborate. They grew into myths that explained creation, death, the movement of celestial bodies, the changing of seasons. These myths were not scientific, but they served a purpose. They provided a coherent worldview that made existence feel less chaotic. They gave meaning to suffering and context to experience, and they unified the group around shared beliefs and values. Rituals marked important transitions. The passage from childhood to adulthood likely involved ceremonies that tested courage and conferred responsibility. Marriages were formalized with rituals that bound not just two individuals, but their families and groups. Deaths were marked with ceremonies that honored the deceased and comforted the living. These rituals created structure and meaning in lives that were often brutal and short. The concept of property began to emerge. While early humans were largely egalitarian by necessity, as tool technology advanced and required more skill to produce, the maker of a particularly fine tool might claim it as their own. It represented hours of work and could not be easily replaced. Similarly, certain hunting or gathering territories might be claimed by specific groups who defended them against outsiders. These were the earliest hints of ownership, concepts that would grow enormously in importance as human societies developed. Innovation continued to accelerate. Someone discovered that heat-treating certain stones before knapping them made them easier to work and produced sharper edges. Someone else figured out that soaking plant fibers and twisting them together created cords stronger than any single fiber. Another person learned that certain clays, when dried, became hard and could hold water or food. Each innovation built on what came before, and the pace of change, glacially slow by modern standards, was revolutionary compared to the millions of years when stone tools had barely changed at all. The control of fire grew more sophisticated. Humans learned to create fire on demand, striking sparks from flint and iron pyrite, or using friction with bow drills or hand drills. No longer dependent on finding and preserving natural fire, they could create it whenever needed. This simple ability had profound consequences. It meant groups could split up and recombine more easily. It meant that losing fire was no longer catastrophic. It meant that fire became a tool that could be deployed strategically, used to drive game or clear land or signal across distances. Cooking with fire transformed the human diet in ways that shaped human evolution. Cooked food was easier to chew and digest, meaning less energy spent on digestion and more available for other functions, including the energy-intensive task of maintaining a large brain. Cooking also broke down toxins in some plants, making previously inedible foods safe. It killed parasites in meat, reducing disease. The benefits were so significant that human jaws and teeth began to evolve, becoming smaller because they no longer needed to be as robust. This is evidence that culture was now influencing biology. The ability to cook also allowed new food preservation techniques. Meat could be smoked, a process that combined heat and smoke to preserve it for weeks or months. Fish could be dried over fires. Seeds and grains could be parched, making them easier to store and transport. These preservation methods created food security that allowed populations to grow and groups forced to stay in one place longer. As groups became more sedentary, even temporarily, they accumulated possessions, unlike nomads who had to carry everything they owned. People who stayed in one place could create and keep larger items, heavier grinding stones for processing plant foods, larger storage containers, more elaborate shelters. This accumulation was the beginning of a profound shift in human lifestyle, though it would be thousands of years before true agriculture emerged. The late Stone Age saw an explosion of innovation. Bows and arrows were developed, allowing hunters to strike from even greater distances with more power and accuracy than thrown spears. Fishing technology advanced with the invention of nets, traps, and boats. Some coastal and river populations became so skilled at fishing that it provided the majority of their diet, reducing dependence on hunting land animals. Boats themselves represented a revolutionary technology. Even simple rafts or dugout canoes opened up new territories. Islands that had been unreachable became accessible. Rivers became highways for travel and trade rather than barriers. Coastal resources, including sea mammals and deep-water fish, could be exploited. The ocean, once a boundary, became a resource and a pathway. Art became more widespread and sophisticated. Carved figurines, decorated tools, beaded jewelry, and elaborate cave paintings appeared across many cultures. Some archaeologists believe this explosion of artistic expression reflects a cognitive shift, evidence that human brains had reached modern levels of capability. Others suggest it simply reflects better preservation of materials or changes in lifestyle that allowed more time for non-survival activities. Whatever the cause, it's clear that by the end of the Stone Age, humans were creating beauty as well as utility. Music likely developed further as well. Bone flutes that have been discovered show that wind instruments existed. Drums could be made from hollow logs or stretched hides. Rattles could be created from gourds or shells filled with seeds. While we cannot hear the music of the Stone Age, we can be certain it existed and that it played a role in ritual, celebration, and social bonding. The accumulation of all these changes meant that late Stone Age humans lived very differently from their earlier ancestors. They had better tools, more reliable food sources, greater control over their environment, and richer cultural lives. They were still subject to the whims of nature, still vulnerable to starvation and predation, still living hard and dangerous lives. But they had pushed back against those dangers, carved out more security, and created space for something beyond mere survival. Yet the fundamental challenge remained the same. Every day began with the question of where food would come from. Every night brought darkness and danger. Every season brought changes that demanded adaptation. The Stone Age was ending. Transitions were beginning toward agriculture and settled life, but the core experience of human existence was still defined by the struggle to survive in a world that offered no guarantees. The generations that lived through this immense span of time did not know they were part of a grand narrative. They did not think of themselves as Stone Age people or wonder what future historians would say about them. They simply lived, day by day, doing what was necessary to see another sunrise. They hunted when they could, gathered what they found, built fires against the cold and dark, made tools to extend their capabilities, told stories to make sense of existence, and held together as groups because alone they would perish. Their lives were hard in ways we can barely imagine. An infected cut could kill. A broken bone could mean death from starvation or predation. Childbirth was dangerous. Infant mortality was high. Life expectancy was short. Most did not live to see 40. Many did not survive childhood. Every person who reached old age had survived dangers that claimed most of their contemporaries. Yet they found joy as well as suffering, the relief of a successful hunt, the warmth of the fire on a cold night, the laughter of children playing, the comfort of familiar faces gathered close, the satisfaction of a well-made tool, the wonder of a starry sky, the taste of ripe berries after days of hunger. These moments of pleasure and peace were rare and precious, but they existed. Human life has never been only suffering, even in the harshest circumstances. And through it all, they learned. They passed knowledge from old to young. They refined techniques and invented new ones. They adapted to changes and survived catastrophes. They spread across the entire world, from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, from coastal shores to high mountain valleys. They became the most adaptable, widespread, and successful large mammal on the planet. Not through superior strength or speed, but through intelligence, cooperation, and an unbreakable will to survive. When we look back at them across the vast span of time that separates us, it's easy to see only the differences. They lacked everything we take for granted. But if we look deeper, we see the similarities. They loved their children as we love ours. They feared death as we do. They sought meaning and purpose. They created beauty. They told stories. They laughed and mourned and hoped and dreamed. They were us. We are them. The same species, the same basic nature, facing different circumstances, but driven by the same fundamental needs and desires. Everything we are, everything we've built, everything we've accomplished rests on the foundation they created through thousands of generations of struggle and adaptation. The Stone Age was not a primitive prelude to real human history. It was the crucible in which humanity was forged. It was the testing ground where the traits that define us were shaped by necessity into their current form. It was the beginning, and that beginning still echoes through everything we do and are. So when you wonder how humans survived the Stone Age, the answer is both simple and profound. They survived through adaptability, through cooperation, through persistence, through ingenuity, through the willingness to keep trying even when failure seemed certain, through bonds of trust and shared purpose, through the accumulation of knowledge across generations, through the refusal to surrender to a world that gave them every reason to give up. They survived because they were human, and in surviving, they made us possible.